This work, okay? Starting off with a concept of where these three braids are going. The urban, the 50, 60, 70% of the world population living in urban areas. Your life online. What does that mean? It's like a shadow world to this great collective collaboration called urbanism is a great collective collaboration called the internet. And thirdly, this great lesson from nature that it still rules supreme viruses. Um, so we have a bunch of strains going on here. Um, so let's jump in. First of all, I wanted to go over something that happened when I was a kid that MIT predicted that in 1972 that society will collapse in this century. New research shows that we're well on schedule. This is why I had you read Bolo Bolo, is what happens when these three braids, the economics of the city, the economics of online activity, our life on internet, and the economics of pandemics. What happens when all three of these things happen? Um, there have been a number of so-called Malthusian meltdowns in history. We shouldn't be too afraid of them, but they do change society. They are not quite black swans, as uh, Nassim Nicholas Taleb said in his book Black Swan. They come out of nowhere and change everything. MIT predicted in 72. I remember this as a kid. My history teacher said, guess what, kids? Um, Computers, scary things, back in 72, predicted the collapse of society. Now, what does collapse mean? I read the Jared Diamond book, Collapse, which charted a few societies, Viking society in Greenland, of Homestead in Montana, various other societies that collapsed. They did not maintain sustainable dynamics in their own worlds. Um, but in this, we can also consider that 16th century China faced a very real Malthusian meltdown, which forced millions into starvation. One could also say that perhaps World War II, a war, was actually a Malthusian meltdown, Malthus being the philosopher behind the idea that population will outstrip food supply because there is an exponential growth in population and not in food supply. Okay, so what are we looking at? We're looking at um, things online, computers. Are we like in the first movie of The Matrix, just embryos growing in fluids, sustained by illusions? The second graph is moral residue, moral things that inform us about these meltdowns. 911 is, Taleb said, was a black swan itself. And then we have this interesting chart here from architects in Vancouver talking about basic tipping points that we should, would, could probably face just because of numbers. We're at a major STEM research university in the world, Stony Brook, and we're all concerned about numbers. But it's how we look at numbers. You are here, 2010. Um, uh, Forecasting with human die-off, without human die-off, we reach 11 billion people. Oh my God. We're almost at 8 billion now. Our food supply decrease, and this is all contingent on industrial input. mostly from China and Asia, but also in the West, this concept of oil production, this one substance that we've pinned our whole fortune to. Look on the left here, life expectancy. Our life expectancy has increased. We were, for many millennia, only supposed to live to our mid 30s. Now we're living way beyond that. With CRISPR engineering, we could live into our mid 100s. You out there could possibly do that with germline, not germline editing, but editing within your existing cells. So we our next step with the reading of Bolo Bolo is not sort of calculating the worst, but being realistic about the numbers. The upper graph talks about moral residue, how we react to certain things, such as the storming of the Capitol in 2021, January 6th, about a year ago. Things like the third year of COVID endemic, but also the moral numbers behind that. Right now, there are even as many people dying of the regular flu as there are of the next variation of COVID. What what are we to believe? What are we to believe about um, these Malthusian meltdowns? We've encountered them quite a few times in our society. I've read this great book called The Sixth Extinction, which the Pleistocene, our era, is supposed to reach a Malthusian point where it reaches tipping points and collapses. So let's delve. Um, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 into the writing, and we have uh, a number of elements at our notion of tipping points. Right here in the middle, we have this sweet spot of discourse, discussion. We have normative ethics, what we should do, how we come across an accident or a robbery or an incident in the subway, and we say, oh my God, I have to react to this violence in the subway, someone getting pushed on the subway again. Um, uh, how do we react? How do we apply our normative ethics? That's the more or less horizontal line. We can call this human empathy. The next line, artificial intelligence. What can we assign to machines to do our so-called bean counting for us? This is troubling because it is bean counting. And if we hearken back to mid-century World War II, out of the Depression era 30s, IBM helped do some number crunching on just the European solution of efficiently getting bodies to concentration camps. So it's all unsettling on an ostensible level. And then we get to CRISPR bioengineering, which is about germline editing of DNA itself. And I think this thirst and quest for identity is part of this. Who are we? Not we as a collective, but me. Who is me? Who am I? In terms of identity, if my basic germline editing can be edited and I can have green gills, I can give my child green gills, or I can graft them onto myself. What are we talking about in terms of identity? COVID-19 woke us up in a primordial fact that viruses and bacteria still run this planet. They acquaint us with this fact over and over again. we have this notion that we could, from our creative billionaires, that we could get out of here. We could go to Mars. We could, supplant ourselves. But why, how, what? The radiation alone in space travel does much to deteriorate our biological selves. Um, uh, Here's another factor. A large solar flare can burst out from the sun, as it did during the American Civil War, 1860s, and knock out all electronics. So we have not our tool support from our electronics. The black swan of COVID is adjusted to large system, as Taleb said. His son Nicholas Taleb, in his book Black Swan, said complex systems are inherently and imminently fragile. The current neoliberal economy is fragile to many tipping points. The 2008 collapse of the subprime system. These things happen to large systems. Too big to fail? No, it's not too big to fail. It is actually prone to failure because it is too big. These things have this convergence in our age. May we live in interesting times. Further, as we mentioned before, the so-called megatrends in your lives during COVID, at home, on Zoom, which is Chinese owned and archived. We digitize everything, but this is a digital shadow, a shadow to ourselves, our cities, the other. We have mobility, or we used to before COVID, in our interactions, communications, social media, placing this out there. We have a convergence of technologies and formats where we can actually mimic the way the brain takes in these different senses in, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, proprioception of different senses, such as shooting a basketball from a distance would include vision, balance, maybe even wind on the skin, things like that. That's proprioception. So we have a certain proprioception with these separate digital elements, even though it is flat. And as Nicholas Carr said in his book I'm reading now, Utopia is Creepy, said, we have no friction in our world. It is very lacking in proprioception. We have a convergence of technologies and formats, but we basically have a convergence of senses, the five senses, which are supposed to culminate, like the skier, in a greater sense of balance, the wind, the light, the vision, the inner ear. We're finding that divorced and pulled apart while it's expected to come together within the screen. Content orientation. What is content? No one knows. In kind of a cancellation of Western culture, which is assumed to be totally imperialistic, which it is not. We have wished, out of good impulses, to re-examine the forms of power within that. Certainly in the past 300-400 years, this has been valid, but not before that. What was the West? What is the West? What is the West now? We're in the West studying this in a Western university, classes taught in a Western way, basically industrial way, where the senses and the subjects are siloed. What does that mean? Who are you studying these things? I've taught for many years in the East, in Singapore, Seoul, Tokyo, lectured in China, lectured in India. Is there a global culture in terms of culture. Um, did the Western Enlightenment and French Revolution triumph in terms of accelerating the needs of the individual, the primacy and the agency of the individual? That's up to question. The user as producer. In Bolton's book, Digital Plenitude, he talks about remix culture, that we're remixing everything, that we're caught in a way in this perpetual nostalgia for the past, which is the present, and not taking a hard look at the future because we know what exists there, a Malthusian meltdown. So in some ways, we're trapped in this continuous present using the old tools, remix culture. Very good book, Digital Plenitude by Bolton. And we're talking about the ambiguity of user and producer in this context. Let's go further. So we have this these tipping points that are almost mathematically proven since the MIT computers of 1972. I remember that quite well as a child. Established population without human die-off is, in a Malthusian sense, supposed to top out at 11 billion. How should we live then? Who are the upper class? What sibling arrangement or relationship is there with the internet and the city as collective projects to overcome space with time? Collective endeavors. Are we going to be living on the internet as in the fabulous short story, The Machine Stopped? These are questions that follow from us, as we see here, from the 19th century, fueled by spending 500 million years of captured solar energy within 200 years. Shocking. And what are our alternatives? What sorts of agencies do we have against, with, for, during Malthusian meltdowns? What we saw under COVID was certainly with the Minneapolis riots, is sort of a glimpse at those most vulnerable to the unemployment, the government protections that were in place for food and shelter, and certainly the usual personages will suffer as a type during this reawakening after COVID as we continue to work. There has been a great migration from actually discontinuing jobs into other jobs or to not working. There has been a surge of financial markets, largely because of the printing of money by the government for aid. And there has been a migration of people to other parts of the country and the world during this period. Population, industrial output, 2100 is the year. Most of us will be gone. Nature, wealth, commoners, elites, each one faces their own response to the carrying capacity of these black swans. Nature and its web suffers, but I love this Talib quote. Nature does not educate or instruct. Nature destroys. This is nature. what we're living through. This is a type of hubris that the sentient human beings have enacted using material, things such as petroleum, cities, the internet, that are well within the province of nature itself. Decline of civilization. MIT predicted 1972 society will collapse this century. Like the 16th century collapsed in China, these will have survival rates, will have survivors, but it is a basic heating up and sort of Malthusian collapse of resources, elements, and above all, population. Food production, population, pollution, of course, surged with this, creating cancers, lung disease, dysentery, unsanitary waters. We say the industrial output has led to different impressions of what we should be doing with this, of course. And onward. Here we are. Here on the left is, again, pate geese having food shoved down their throat. And here is Zuckerberg with his early adopters of the VR. What is the difference? Space of flows creates behavioral conditionings. The model of the self is that the container is ourselves. These things go into ourselves. We have this questioning of identity, but it revolves around what goes in. When you watch a Netflix movie, what goes in? When you intend to queue up on a Netflix movie, what goes in? When you decide to live with someone during COVID, what goes in and what does not go in? Nicholas Carr said we have this dichotomy between home and away. That home is comforting, but it is also stultifying. Away is liberating, mobile, but it also leads to loneliness. What are the limits and what are the dimensions of the human appreciation of these dichotomies? What's on the inside? What is stimulated on the outside? What can possibly be stimulated within a small house with a family, with an intimate, with parents, with anyone who exists as the other? Consider again this dichotomy of home and away being more difficult in the time of COVID. And then we'll kind of end up, for now, in, and I showed this before, germline enhancement. These are the sciences people are not talking about. These are the sciences, the categories of choice around bifurcation of history, moral discussion, perfect monsters. Designer babies. What we are doing with 100,000 years of human development and what we can do in the span of one visit to a fertility clinic. In that one afternoon, we can change 100 million years of development. We could posit to say that we are the urban animal. We are the apes in the ant-heap. We enjoy our ant-heaps. But there's a certain gene they had isolated for urban existence. How and why and where did that happen? Could we form certain genes, certain DNA, certain germline editing toward an animal that is a Homo sapien that is used to space travel, for example? Is this all environmental? Could we design babies that have fantastic memories for things complex and digital and so forth? Um, Contrast that with plastic surgery, just changing ourselves on the outside, which also seems to be a rage right now, that we do not want to deal with it or change the cards we're dealt and change it by plastic surgery. I think we see a tipping point in this also, a type of meltdown, a moral meltdown more than Malthusian, that why do we think of these things after the fact when perhaps some of the more difficult decisions are made in the design table? We can cure for future generations of malaria, of HIV, of Alzheimer's, of Parkinson's. That certainly has a moral bearing behind it. Why should these people be dealt that card? We could say nature is pretty much amoral and benign. Well, nature had intended for these people to die off. That's just, sorry, that's the cards dealt. But within cities now, and within internet culture now, and within an inspection of COVID, we want to think about germline enhancement, the sort of collision of these two areas, categories of choice. I talked about Ava Alou's notion of what is maximizing our choices and what is satisficing our choices within systems. Certainly, these are endless discussions, but when things are done in a lab and put into embryos, stem cells, it comes out the other end. We are animals that have had 10 to 15% mutation rates anyway, so we could make the claim of nature in saying, hey, we've just ramped that up. We've turned it up to maybe 70, 80% instead of 10 or 15%. Look at dog breeders. Look at horse breeders. They'd been doing the same thing for millennia. Plant breeders. We could say yes, but it's in that acceleration that we have to consider a discussion, a tipping point. What if we consider this Malthusian tipping point is inevitable because of the numbers? Are cities untenable because of the compression and the lack of jobs? And just the bigger question of if everything's automated, does that free humans up to do what other than work? We've gone through cycles of getting jobs so we could spend money from those jobs, this self-sustaining system. But basically, in this new category of designer babies, we can say, who will remain? Who, if we encounter, as in the MIT prediction, a Malthusian meltdown, who, what, where, when, why would these groups of people remain? There is a seed bank above the Arctic Circle in Norway that was, I think, made, designed, built by anonymous rich people, billionaires. And within this seed bank are pretty much every seed from plants that existed, stored away, kept frozen in a state of suspension. We also have this notion in our universities that semantics control us. It's all a function of memes and what language has done to us. Interesting. Don't think this is quite true because we can also consider DNA a language. Are we really used to cities? Are we really used to living there? Could we really survive mentally, another pandemic, which has become endemic, living in our tiny spaces and pitting those homeless people in our subways now that have no home to go to because of the fantastic cost of spaces. These things are salient. These things are attended by real numbers. These things can be addressed, and the so-called solutions in designer babies must be discussed as this is some of the greatest discourses we can have within these tipping points itself. The black swans, the working out of the long tail, cultivating in the long tail, as we see in jobs, we see in social media, we see in dating sites. Who are we going to cultivate within these long tails that the internet seems to be doing much better than in person and public engagement does? And then ultimately, what, where, how, why are we pushing our designer babies, our idea of designing the human self to withstand these cataclysms, to withstand our so-called untenable cities, which have 3 days of food supply? Where are we going with that final technological notion where it seems our tools have outstripped our morality, actually? What is in that dark quadrant of germline editing? Again, 3 braids: cities, interconnected cities, the internet, which connects us, and nasty little things like COVID-19. See you in the next class.